In the shadow of our everyday lives, hidden beneath the mundane routines and comforting modernity, ancient whispers still linger. Stories of women who command the forces of nature, who walk unseen among us, weaving spells and binding fates. These are the witches, figures of fear, fascination, and forbidden power. Tonight, we will explore the chilling legends of witches who never truly left. From cursed forests to enchanted mirrors, their presence can still be felt. Are these tales just remnants of superstition? Or is something darker lurking just out of sight? Turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the world around you. The Shadow in the Cursed Forest, Salem, Massachusetts. Jessica and Mark were a young couple who had always dreamed of leaving the chaos of Boston for a quieter life. When Mark's job offered him the chance to work remotely, they jumped at the opportunity to move to Salem. The town's reputation for witch trials and dark history intrigued them, especially Jessica, a graduate student in history who was passionate about uncovering hidden stories. Their new home was a charming colonial house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. From the moment they arrived, Jessica felt the pull of the forest. Locals called it the Cursed Hollow, and stories about its eerie past only fueled her curiosity. Jessica often heard whispered warnings from their neighbors. "People don't go wandering in those woods," an elderly woman named Margaret told her one day at the market. "Not unless you want to meet the Lantern Woman. She's been there since the witch trials, looking for someone foolish enough to follow her light." Jessica dismissed these warnings as folklore, the kind of stories meant to scare children. Mark, ever the skeptic, found the tales amusing. "It's probably just a way to keep teenagers from drinking in the woods," he joked. But one evening, as Jessica sat in their small study, researching the witch trials, she stumbled upon the story of Rebecca Hayes, a woman accused of witchcraft in 1692. According to court documents, Rebecca was known for luring children into the woods with a lantern, where they would disappear without a trace. Witnesses claimed to see her performing strange rituals under the moonlight, chanting in a language no one recognized. She was hanged in what was now called Gallows Hill, but her body was never buried. Legend had it that Rebecca cursed the town before her death, promising to return and claim the descendants of those who had betrayed her. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the forest seemed alive, its trees swaying unnaturally in the darkness. At midnight, a faint light caught her attention through the curtains. Peering outside, she saw a flickering glow moving among the trees. It was a lantern, and whoever carried it was slowly weaving through the forest edge. Jessica felt her heart race with a mix of fear and excitement. This was her chance to uncover the truth behind the legend. Ignoring Mark's sleeping figure, she grabbed her coat and flashlight and stepped into the chilly night. As she approached the woods, the air seemed to thicken, and her flashlight began to flicker. She called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The lantern's glow stopped abruptly as if whoever held it had heard her. Then it moved again, deeper into the forest. Against her better judgment, Jessica followed. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by an oppressive silence. The lantern's glow bobbed ahead, always just out of reach. Jessica quickened her pace, determined not to lose sight of it. Suddenly, she stumbled into a clearing, and there, under the pale moonlight, she saw her. The Lantern Woman. The figure was draped in a tattered cloak, her face obscured by a deep hood. But it wasn't the woman's appearance that froze Jessica in place. It was her eyes, glowing like embers in the dark. The woman raised her lantern, and its eerie green light illuminated the clearing. Jessica felt her legs weaken as whispers filled the air, voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Who are you?" Jessica managed to stammer. The woman's voice was like a song carried on the wind, both beautiful and chilling. "You've come to me willingly," she said. "Do you know what that means?" Jessica shook her head, trembling. The woman stepped closer, her feet not touching the ground. "It means you belong to me now." Before Jessica could scream, the lantern flared brightly, blinding her. She woke hours later at the edge of the woods, her clothes damp with morning dew, and her memory of the night fragmented. Mark found her sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the forest. "Jess, what the hell happened? I woke up and you were gone," he shouted, but she couldn't answer. Over the following weeks, Jessica became distant, spending hours gazing out the window at the forest. One night, Mark woke to find her standing in the backyard, barefoot and holding a lantern that glowed with the same green light. Her eyes, once warm and curious, were now cold and empty. She turned to him and whispered, "She's waiting for you." Mark disappeared the next day. The townsfolk claimed they saw him wandering into the forest at dusk, his movements slow and unnatural. Jessica remained in the house, but she was no longer the woman Mark had loved. Now, every night, 2 lanterns flicker at the edge of the cursed woods, and the people of Salem know better than to follow their light. The Witch's Mirror, Savannah, Georgia. Carrie had always dreamed of living in Savannah, with its cobblestone streets, hanging moss, and rich history. When she found a dilapidated Victorian house on Forsyth Park for a fraction of its value, she couldn't believe her luck. The house was old and creaky, but Carrie saw potential in its faded charm. As an artist, she was drawn to spaces with character, and this house was brimming with it. While cleaning out the attic, Carrie discovered an enormous mirror wrapped in dusty linen. The frame was carved from dark wood and decorated with intricate symbols she didn't recognize. It was beautiful, but something about it unsettled her. She chalked it up to the mirror's age and brought it downstairs to her studio. The light from the tall windows reflected perfectly off its surface, casting the room in a golden glow. Carrie became increasingly attached to the mirror, often finding herself staring into it for long periods. But strange things began to happen. At first, she noticed subtle changes in her reflection, her smile lingering longer than it should, her eyes darting away when she wasn't moving. Then came the whispers. At night, as she lay in bed, she would hear faint murmurs from the direction of the studio. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and melodic, calling her name. Unnerved, Carrie decided to research the mirror's origin. She visited the local historical society and described the frame's carvings. An elderly curator's face turned pale when she showed him a photo. "That mirror belonged to Julia Moore," he said. "They called her the Witch of Savannah. She was a practitioner of black magic, and that mirror, it was her conduit. She used it to trap souls." Carrie laughed nervously, but the man's expression didn't change. "She was killed in her home by an angry mob," he continued. "But before she died, she vowed that anyone who touched her mirror would be claimed by her spirit." And that night, Carrie tried to move the mirror out of her house, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the floor had fused to its base. Exhausted, she went to bed, only to wake to the sound of laughter. The studio door was ajar, and the mirror glowed faintly in the dark. She stepped inside, and her reflection smiled at her. Not with her lips, but with cold, unfeeling eyes. The next morning, her neighbor found Carrie painting furiously in the studio, her hands covered in blood-red paint. The canvas depicted a woman in black emerging from the mirror. Carrie looked up and said, "She's free now." The mirror disappeared after that night, but locals swear it reappears in antique shops, waiting for its next owner. And Carrie? Some say she's still painting, her soul trapped in the mirror's dark depths. The Silent Harvest, Iowa. cornfields. Emma and Caleb were a young couple who had just moved to a small town in rural Iowa. Caleb had inherited an old farmhouse surrounded by endless fields of corn. It was isolated, but they thought it would be the perfect place to start a new life. The townsfolk were friendly, though their conversations always carried an undercurrent of unease when the subject of the fields came up. "Don't go wandering into the corn at night," warned an old farmer at the general store. "There are things older than you know out there." Emma laughed it off. She loved walking through the fields, finding peace in the rustling of the stalks. But one evening, as she walked deeper into the rows, she noticed something strange. The corn husks were burned black at the edges, as if touched by fire. The deeper she went, the darker and more withered the plants became. In the center of the field, she found a small, scorched clearing. On the ground was a crude circle made of corn husks, with strange symbols etched into the soil. She told Caleb, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably kids messing around. That night, however, Emma woke to the sound of rustling outside their bedroom window. Peeking out, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the field. It was a woman, her long hair matted with dirt, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Emma froze, unable to look away as the woman raised her hand and pointed directly at her. The next morning, Caleb found the same symbols etched into the dirt just outside the house. Emma insisted they call the police, but when they arrived, the marks were gone. Over the following days, Emma grew paranoid. She began hearing whispers when she was alone in the house, and her dreams were filled with the image of the woman surrounded by corn that seemed to writhe and twist as though alive. Desperate for answers, Emma visited the town library and uncovered a local legend. In the 1800s, a woman named Abigail Shaw had been accused of witchcraft after several children went missing during harvest season. The townspeople claimed she had cursed their crops and sacrificed the children to ensure her own immortality. They burned her at the edge of the fields, but her final words chilled them to the bone. "The harvest will always be mine." That night, Caleb vanished. Emma found his boots at the edge of the field, but there was no trace of him. She spent the next week searching, calling his name into the endless rows of corn. On the 7th night, she awoke to the sound of Caleb's voice calling her from the fields. Grabbing a flashlight, she ran outside, following the sound deeper and deeper into the stalks. In the clearing, she found him, or what was left of him. His body was contorted, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. Standing over him was Abigail Shaw, her eyes burning like embers. The last thing Emma saw was the corn bending unnaturally toward her, wrapping around her limbs as the whispers grew deafening. Now, locals say you can hear Emma's screams in the fields during the harvest moon, and if you see a figure at the edge of the corn, it's already too late. The Bayou Witch, Louisiana. In the heart of Louisiana's swamps, where the water glistens like black glass and the cypress trees loom like silent sentinels, there is a legend whispered by the locals. They speak of Marie Laveau, a powerful witch who once ruled the bayou. Unlike the famed voodoo queen of New Orleans, this Marie was no healer. She was said to lure travelers into the swamp with promises of fortune and power, only to steal their souls and bind them to the water forever. Jake and his friends, eager to prove the legend wrong, planned a weekend trip deep into the bayou. They rented a small boat and set off early in the morning, laughing at the warnings of the old woman who rented it to them. "Don't go near the old house in the swamp," she had said, her eyes clouded with fear. "It's hers. You won't come back." The group found the house by accident late that afternoon. It stood on stilts above the murky water, half hidden by Spanish moss. The shutters banged in the wind, and the air grew thick with the smell of rot. Jake's girlfriend, Sarah, was uneasy. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, but Jake brushed her off and led the way inside. The house was eerily intact, despite its decayed exterior. On the walls were symbols carved into the wood, spiraling patterns that seemed to twist and move when you looked at them for too long. In the center of the room was a table with an old, cracked mirror. Sarah swore she saw something move in the glass, but when she called Jake over, it was just her reflection. That night, as they camped near the house, strange things began to happen. Their fire refused to stay lit, and the swamp was unnaturally quiet. Then, at midnight, they heard the singing. It was a haunting melody, coming from the direction of the house. Jake grabbed a flashlight and started toward the sound, but Sarah begged him not to go. "It's her," she cried. "She's trying to lure you." Jake ignored her and walked toward the house, the light from his flashlight bouncing off the dark water. As he approached, the singing grew louder, and he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her hair long and tangled, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like a predator's. She smiled at him, beckoning him closer. The others watched from the campsite, frozen with fear as Jake disappeared into the house. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, Sarah worked up the courage to go after him, but when she entered the house, it was empty. The only thing she found was the mirror, now perfectly polished. In its reflection, she saw not herself, but Jake, his mouth open in a silent scream, his hands clawing at the glass. Sarah fled, but the swamp would not let her go. The boat was gone, and the water seemed to rise, cutting off every path. She spent the night hiding in the reeds, the sound of the witch's laughter echoing around her. By morning, she was found by locals, half mad and babbling about the mirror. No one ever found Jake, but they say that on quiet nights, when the swamp is still, you can hear his voice calling for help. The house remains, waiting for its next visitors, and Marie Laveau still watches from the shadows, her hunger never satisfied. The Witch of Raven Hill, Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where mist clings to the peaks and the forests grow so thick they block out the sun, there is a place the locals avoid at all costs: Raven Hill. The stories say that anyone who ventures there never comes back the same. Some claim to hear disembodied laughter on the wind, others speak of shadowy figures moving through the trees. But the most chilling tale is of Eleanor Blackwood, the Witch of Raven Hill. Eleanor was a healer in the late 1800s, living alone in a small cabin atop the hill. When a sickness swept through the nearby mining town of Claiborne, Eleanor treated the sick with herbs and poultices, saving many lives. But when the sickness returned, stronger than before, the desperate townsfolk accused her of bringing the plague upon them. They stormed her cabin one stormy night, dragging her out into the rain. She cursed them with her final breath. "Your blood will bind you to this hill forever." Generations later, Matt and his college friends decided to hike up Raven Hill during their summer break. They had heard the stories but dismissed them as small-town superstition. They followed an old trail that twisted and turned through dense woods. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to grow darker, even though it was midday. At the summit, they found the ruins of Eleanor's cabin. The walls were charred black, and the ground was littered with fragments of bones. In the center of the cabin, untouched by time, stood a stone cauldron. Carved into its surface were symbols none of them recognized. One of Matt's friends, Claire, leaned in to take a closer look. "This is amazing," she said, tracing the symbols with her fingers. "It's like some kind of ritual markings." The moment her fingers touched the stone, the forest fell silent. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. "We need to go," Matt said, his voice shaking. But when they turned to leave, the trail was gone. The forest seemed to shift and twist around them, trapping them on the hill. Night fell quickly, and with it came the shadows. The friends huddled together, trying to stay calm, but the footsteps grew closer, circling the cabin. Then they saw her, a tall figure cloaked in black, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes glowing a faint red. She raised a hand, and the cauldron began to bubble, though there was no fire beneath it. A voice echoed through the air, soft and mocking. "You came to my hill. Now you'll stay." One by one, the friends disappeared into the darkness. Matt was the last, running through the trees as Eleanor's laughter chased him. He stumbled into a clearing where the townsfolk of Claiborne stood, their faces pale and empty, their eyes hollow. They reached for him, pulling him into the earth as the shadows closed in. The next morning, hikers found the remains of the camp, torn sleeping bags, a burnt-out flashlight, and claw marks on the trees. Of Matt and his friends, there was no trace. Locals say that on certain nights, you can hear their screams echoing from Raven Hill, and Eleanor's red eyes watching from the treetops. The keeper of Ash Hollow, Oregon coast. Along the rugged cliffs of the Oregon coast, there's a hidden cove known as Ash Hollow. The cove is shrouded in mist most of the year, and the waves crash against jagged rocks like an eternal warning to stay away. Fishermen avoid it, and hikers speak of strange noises coming from the cliffs. Low whispers, the sound of crying, and occasionally, a faint, haunting song. The legend of Ash Hollow tells of Margaret Dane, a woman who vanished there over a century ago and was said to have returned as a witch. Margaret had been a lighthouse keeper in the late 1800s. She lived alone, tending the light that guided ships through the dangerous coastal waters. The townspeople whispered about her reclusive nature and her fascination with the sea. Some claimed she spoke to it, standing on the cliffs for hours, chanting in an unknown language. One stormy night, the light in the lighthouse went out, and a ship carrying a wealthy merchant's family crashed into the rocks. When the townspeople went to confront Margaret the next day, she was gone. Her lighthouse was empty, and the only trace of her was a trail of footprints leading to the edge of the cliff. Decades later, the lighthouse was abandoned, but the stories persisted. Ships that strayed too close to Ash Hollow were said to hear her song, a melody so beautiful and mournful it would lure sailors to their doom. Those who survived swore they saw a woman in the water, her eyes glowing like the moon, her hands reaching up as if to pull them under. When Ella, a travel photographer, heard the story, she couldn't resist. She had a talent for capturing eerie, forgotten places, and Ash Hollow seemed perfect. She hiked the treacherous path to the cove, her camera slung over her shoulder. The closer she got, the heavier the air became, as though the mist itself was alive, pressing against her lungs. At the base of the cliff, she found the remains of the lighthouse. The door creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase that led to the top. Inside, the walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols of waves, moons, and human figures sinking beneath the surface. As Ella photographed them, she heard a faint sound, a woman's voice, humming a tune that sent chills down her spine. Ignoring her growing unease, she climbed to the top of the lighthouse. There, she found a broken lamp and a single waterlogged journal. The last entry was scrawled in frantic handwriting. "She's calling me. I must go to her." As Ella read, the humming grew louder. Looking out over the cove, she saw a figure standing on the rocks below. The woman's hair flowed like seaweed, her dress tattered and wet. When Ella raised her camera, the woman turned her head. Her face was pale, her eyes glowing a soft, unearthly green. Then, she smiled. The next thing Ella knew, she was at the water's edge. The waves lapped at her feet, and the woman stood before her, now impossibly close. "You shouldn't have come," the woman said, her voice as cold as the sea. Before Ella could scream, the waves rose, pulling her under. Her camera was found washed ashore days later, the last photo showing the woman's face. Her eyes glowing, her mouth twisted in a grin that seemed almost alive. To this day, the lighthouse at Ash Hollow stands empty, and Margaret's song can still be heard, luring the curious and the foolish to their doom. At the Blood Moon Coven, New Mexico Desert. The New Mexico Desert is a place of quiet desolation, its vast emptiness broken only by jagged mesas and scattered shrubs. At night, the stars light up the sky like a tapestry of diamonds, but on certain nights when the moon turns red, the desert is far from peaceful. Locals tell of the Blood Moon Coven, a group of witches who were said to have performed dark rituals in the area during the late 19th century. Their spirits, they say, still haunt the desert, drawn to the blood moon that once empowered their spells. Sarah and Nick were amateur ghost hunters who traveled the country in search of paranormal hotspots. When they heard about the coven and the strange disappearances near Black Mesa, they knew they had to investigate. Armed with cameras, voice recorders, and a drone, they arrived the day before the blood moon was set to rise. Their campsite was set up at the base of Black Mesa, a towering rock formation that jutted out of the desert like a monolith. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it whispers that neither of them could quite place. As night fell, they ventured toward the mesa, where they found strange carvings on the rocks, spirals, sigils, and images of women standing beneath a blood-red moon. Sarah's voice recorder picked up faint chanting, though they heard nothing with their ears. "This is incredible," Nick said, his excitement overshadowing his fear. But Sarah felt uneasy. "It's too quiet," she muttered. Even the wind stopped. As the moon rose, its crimson light bathed the desert in an otherworldly glow. The air grew heavy, and Sarah and Nick's equipment began to malfunction. Batteries drained, cameras refused to focus. That's when they saw the figures. Women dressed in flowing black robes stood in a circle on the mesa, their heads tilted back as they chanted in unison. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their voices filled the air, a melody both beautiful and horrifying. Nick whispered, "We're not alone." He raised his camera, but the lens fogged over as if the air itself was pushing him away. One of the witches turned toward them, her eyes glowing like embers. Her gaze froze them in place. "You've trespassed?" she said, her voice echoing as though 1,000 voices spoke through her. The ground beneath them began to shake. Out of the rocks rose skeletal hands, clawing at their legs, pulling them toward the circle. Sarah screamed as she was dragged to the center, where the witches surrounded her. Nick tried to pull her free, but a force threw him back. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the witches lifting their arms to the sky, the moon glowing brighter as Sarah's screams were swallowed by the wind. When Nick woke, the desert was empty. Sarah was gone, and the only trace of her was a single black robe lying in the sand. He stumbled back to the campsite, but the car wouldn't start. Walking to the nearest road, he found a police officer who listened to his frantic story with a grim expression. "You're lucky you made it out," the officer said. "No one ever does." Nick never spoke of what happened again, but on nights when the blood moon rises, people swear they see a new figure among the coven, her voice joining the ancient chant. The Witch of Frost Hollow, Maine Woods. Deep in the woods of Maine, where the trees grow so thick they blot out the sun, lies a small valley known as Frost Hollow. The air there is unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer, and locals claim it's cursed. The legend centers on Agatha Frost, a midwife and herbalist from the 1700s who was accused of witchcraft after a series of mysterious deaths in the nearby town of Elmwood. They say she was drowned in the icy river that cuts through the hollow, but her spirit never left. Megan, a nature photographer, had heard the stories while staying in a nearby cabin. Drawn to the idea of capturing the eerie beauty of the hollow, she decided to explore it alone. Armed with her camera and a GPS, She set out early one morning, ignoring the warnings of her host. "The Hollow doesn't like visitors," he had said. "People go in, but they don't always come out." As Megan descended into the valley, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost clung to the trees, glinting in the weak sunlight. She found the ruins of an old stone cottage, half buried in snow despite the warm season. Inside, the air was stifling, and strange markings covered the walls. Megan snapped a few pictures, her breath visible in the icy air. As she explored further, she came upon the river. Its surface was frozen solid, the ice so clear it looked like glass. Something glimmered beneath it, a faint shape that looked disturbingly like a woman's face, her eyes open and staring. Megan stumbled back, but the air around her grew heavy, and whispers began to fill her ears. She turned, and there stood Agatha Frost, her figure cloaked in ice, her eyes glowing an unearthly blue. "You shouldn't have come here," Agatha said, her voice as cold as the air. Megan tried to run, but the ground beneath her turned to ice, and she slipped, falling hard. Agatha glided toward her, the frost spreading in her wake. "Do you know what they did to me?" Agatha whispered, her icy hand reaching out to touch Megan's cheek. The cold was unbearable, and Megan's vision began to blur. When she woke, she was lying at the edge of the hollow, her camera frozen solid, her hands frostbitten. She stumbled back to the cabin where her host looked at her with pity. "You're lucky," he said. "She let you live. Most aren't so fortunate." Megan left Maine the next day, but the photos on her camera haunted her. Among the shots of the hollow were images she hadn't taken, pictures of Agatha, her frozen face staring directly into the lens, and one of Megan herself, lying unconscious in the snow, with Agatha standing over her, smiling. The Witch of Blackwater Mill, South Carolina. Tucked away in the South Carolina low country, surrounded by moss-draped cypress trees and winding waterways, lies the remains of Blackwater Mill. Once a thriving lumber town, it fell into ruin after a series of tragedies, fires, drownings, and mysterious disappearances. Locals believe the downfall began with Annabelle Crane, a healer accused of witchcraft in the early 1800s. She was blamed for every misfortune that struck the town and was ultimately tied to a millstone and thrown into the river. Her final curse was whispered through bloodied lips: "Your wealth will rot, and your children will feed the river." The mill collapsed soon after, its workers vanishing without a trace, and the town became a ghost of its former self. Emily and her friends had heard about Blackwater Mill during a road trip through the South. They were fascinated by the stories and decided to explore the ruins, despite warnings from locals at a nearby diner. "She still watches over that place," one elderly woman said. "And she doesn't take kindly to visitors." The group ignored the warnings, venturing into the swamp with their flashlights and cameras. The air was thick with humidity, and the buzzing of insects grew quieter the closer they got to the mill. When they reached the ruins, the air turned colder, and the swamp seemed unnaturally still. The millstone, half buried in the mud, loomed like a forgotten monument. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as she noticed faint carvings on its surface, spirals and symbols she couldn't decipher. As the group explored, strange things began to happen. One by one, their flashlights flickered and died. Emily heard splashes in the water, though nothing was visible. Then came the whispers. Soft, chilling words that seemed to come from all directions. "Leave," they said. "You don't belong here." One of her friends, Jake, ventured too close to the water's edge. He slipped and fell, and as Emily rushed to help him, she saw a pale hand rise from the murky depths, grasping his ankle. Jake screamed as he was dragged under. The group panicked, running in all directions. Emily, now alone, stumbled through the ruins, her heart pounding. Near the millstone, she saw her. Annabelle Crane stood in the shadows, her dress tattered and soaked, her hair hanging in wet strands. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You disturb my rest," she said, her voice echoing like the wind. "Now you'll join the others." The next morning, locals found Emily's car abandoned by the roadside. Her friends were never seen again, and the millstone remained, its carvings now deeper and darker, as if feeding on the souls it claimed. The Hollow Bride, Vermont. In the quiet hills of Vermont, near the town of Maple Hollow, stands an abandoned church known as Hollow Chapel. Its steeple leans precariously, and its windows are shattered, but the townsfolk keep their distance. They say the church is cursed, haunted by Evelyn Marsh, a bride who vanished on her wedding night in 1903. Evelyn was to marry a wealthy merchant named Thomas Gray. Her beauty was renowned, and the entire town turned out to see the ceremony. But as she walked down the aisle, the church doors burst open, and a figure cloaked in black stormed inside. The woman, later revealed to be Thomas's scorned former lover, accused Evelyn of witchcraft, claiming she had used dark magic to ensnare Thomas. Panicked and enraged, the townsfolk turned on Evelyn. They dragged her to the altar, where the black-cloaked woman placed a silver cross against her skin. Evelyn screamed as it burned her flesh, and she cursed the town with her dying breath. "You'll never know peace. Your happiness will turn to ash." That night, the church burned to the ground, taking Evelyn's body with it. A century later, the church remains in ruins, and no weddings have been held in Maple Hollow since. But on moonless nights, people claim to see a figure in a torn wedding gown walking among the ruins, her veil trailing behind her like mist. When Ben, a documentary filmmaker, heard the story, he decided to visit Hollow Chapel. He wanted to capture footage for a project on cursed places and didn't believe in ghosts. With a camera in hand, he ventured into the chapel at dusk. The air was colder inside, and the smell of smoke lingered, as if the fire from a century ago had never truly extinguished. As he filmed the crumbling walls and rotting pews, he noticed something strange in his footage. In the background, just behind the altar, was a faint figure, a woman in white. Turning around, he saw nothing. But when he looked back at the camera, the figure was closer. A sudden knock echoed through the chapel, followed by soft, muffled weeping. Ben froze as the figure materialized before him. Evelyn Marsh stood in her scorched wedding gown, her veil partially covering her charred face. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her lips moved soundlessly, as though reciting her vows. Then she spoke. "Do you take me to be yours?" Her voice was low and raspy, filled with sorrow and rage. Before Ben could react, she reached out, her hand blackened and skeletal, and touched his chest. His camera fell to the ground as the screen went dark. Days later, hikers found Ben's camera near the chapel. The footage showed him standing at the altar, his face pale and lifeless, as Evelyn's ghost walked away, her veil billowing in the wind. To this day, her ghost remains, waiting for another soul to say, "I do."